Hello and welcome to Perennial Podcast episode 5. Today we have Ivan the Heathen, who has a great channel that I recommend all of you check out. The link is in the description. How are you doing, Ivan?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on, Eric. After all the comment wars we've been in over the years, it's nice to be here. So,
They've been
thanks.
brotherly wars, just so you know.
No
And
yours.
and how are you doing, Ken?
I'm doing great. How about you?
Not bad. So in the third installment of this, you and I were talking about aesthetics, and I mentioned the notion that without a concept of the good or the beautiful, you couldn't really have a concept of the true. In my opinion, ultimately, truth, beauty, and goodness must reduce down to something that is essentially identical. And the way I see it, they are all based on a similar kind of intuition. So when we see the equation 2 plus 2 equals 4, we have a sense that grounds the arithmetic calculation that is prior to the formalized system of mathematics. And that's basically Gödel's insight. Any formalized system relies on something that is not formal, so ordinary language or ordinary meaning. And the sense that we get out of those basic truth propositions, in my eyes, is an intuition that is almost identical, if not identical, to the intuition that we have of the beautiful and the good. And mathematicians, and I know that Ivan has a background with mathematics, so mathematicians do find excellent mathematics beautiful. And in my own opinion, I find moral behavior beautiful. So there's all sorts of lines between these categories that have led me to have the suspicion that these are ultimately one and the same. What do you make of that judgment, Ivan?
I tend, generally speaking, to incline in more or less the same direction. There are difficulties that emerge when you get into specifics. So, for example, if you wish to reduce goodness, truth, and beauty into one in some sense, we would of course have to be clear of exactly what it is we're talking about. One can always imagine counterexamples or apparent counterexamples. A very good-looking person who does evil things. Let's say, or something of that nature. I remember Dostoevsky in opening up Crime and Punishment emphasizes that Raskolnikov is a very attractive, good-looking man. And then there's, of course, the saying that the devil has the power to assume a pleasing shape. So there do seem to be these difficulties on the fringes. And while I am willing to accept that with sufficient ingenuity or creativity, we may be able to work these things out or explain them, there are difficulties there, and I'm open to being persuaded to the kind of view that you've described, because again, I generally incline in the same direction. But there's, I guess, more for me to explore before I'm fully satisfied with something robust that I've completely worked out in every way.
Well, great. That was the original intention with this podcast, to set up an environment where we do try to reach consensus, even if it's not entirely possible. But Ken, what are your opening thoughts on this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I definitely think there are layers of this. When we talk about Dostoevsky, it's the Christian context that we have to see, where the Christian is supposed to deny the flesh and deny lustful things, which some people would say, well, that's what beauty is. It's what is lustfully appealing. And I would bring it back to the three systems of morality that I outlined between aesthetics, the ascetic, and the emotional, where lust is really a basic animal emotion. And so beauty, in the definition of an emotional person, is a lustful woman or a man who's good looking. But from an aesthetic position, there's going to be different physical traits that are valued there. So we have to then parse out, what do we mean by a beautiful looking man, a beautiful looking woman? There are these different physical archetypes. And it depends on which kind of moral system you're working within. If you're in the porn industry, a beautiful woman's going to look a certain way. But if you're looking to paint a classical nude painting from, the 17th century, a beautiful woman's going to look very different, have a different body type, a different facial structure. And it can differ from culture to culture. Really, what I'm trying to say is that there is a moral system behind every idea of beauty. So when we have a clash of, oh, well, that woman or that man looks beautiful, but they don't act in a moral way, part of the problem there is that we're having competing systems of morality, and we haven't clarified what moral system we're working with, or we haven't purified that moral system, and therefore we're having this confusion. I mean, you could, and I'm not totally denying the inconsistency that you're pointing out, but I do think there is a general tendency of different people who have different moral inclinations are selecting different physical types, and then you have a correlation between those physical types and the moral system. So they're all reaching towards something. And so when we talk about this convergence between goodness and beauty and truth, it's a directional thing and not merely a static, like, oh, well, this person looks a certain way, therefore they have to be this way. But that we're looking over long periods of time. We're looking at the evolutionary flow where people who have a certain ideal are going to select certain traits and then sort of flow in that direction. Those are my initial thoughts.
Yeah, I can.
I would agree
sure.
with. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I would agree with that insofar as it seems pretty clear that before one can judge that, let's say, some given work of art is beautiful or aesthetically successful, one must have a notion of what it is to be aesthetically successful.
Mm-hmm.
To be beautiful, one must aspire to some ideal, whatever that happens to be. And there is certainly a sense in which once one grants that and then says, all right, the ideal is such and such, that one must implicitly introduce to that some notion of goodness. Because the idea is, well, we're striving for this ideal, and the ideal is to be strived for because it is good, because it is an ideal. So that there is that convergence. So as I said, in sort of broad strokes, I am sympathetic to this kind of view. It's on the particulars that difficulties arise for me.
Right. I agree with Ken that essentially both all truth, beauty, and goodness are asymptotes, and everything that we do ends up being recursive processes of striving after these kind of unattainable ideals. But all of them do share some things in common. So when we talk about the ideal of beauty, take the physical form, for instance. There are elements of the physical form that we appreciate for utilitarian purposes. So if a woman has, wide hips and large breasts, then this is an indication of fertility, right? But then if we're looking at, say, a Mandelbrot set, that is still beautiful, even though there's nothing there that, at least at face value, appears to trigger emotional and evolutionary kind of preconditioned aspects. So there's some kind of pure beauty beyond the function. So there's form and there's function, and there's something in form, an evidence of a kind of truth, symmetry, mathematical relationships. I mean, if you go into music, the music of J.S. Bach is almost universally considered beautiful. Baroque music, classical music is widely acceptable all over the world, regardless of your cultural circumstances, because these do embed mathematical relationships. They set forward very basic axioms and then invert the pattern or move it in retrograde. They speed it up, they slow it down, they transpose it into different keys. But all of this is evidence of a maintenance of some kind of permanence, which I think harkens back to the ideal of the universal. Now, just to segue, which I mentioned also in that third episode, Plato's ideal of beauty, he sees as being a recollection of our past lives' experience of the good. And so when we see something in the mundane realm that's beautiful, that evokes the sentiment that it does in us because it reminds us of this ideal type, the type of types, namely that of the good. And so this is particularly why I wanted Ivan on, because he has a great series on nominalism. And in my mind, if you hold to some variety of realism, you're going to run into this notion of the type of types, the universal of universals. And so these three kind of life ordering functions, search after truth, search after beauty, search after goodness, all of those must converge in a realist interpretation. At least that's what I make of it. So, what do you think, Ivan?
No, I would agree. Again, it's not the broad strokes of the theory that caused me trouble. It's the specifics. I would agree certainly insofar as all things seem to converge in God's simplicity, all his attributes reduced to one and the same reality, one and the same sort of fundamental kind of source of being, and that insofar as all these other things, be they goodness, truth, beauty, what have you, insofar as they flow from God, which they do, they also have to return to their source in Him and thereby converge into one. It's just once we then get down into the world of composition and finitude and so forth, what then do we do? Right? Because now we have all manner of difficulties and problems before us. I mean, there's a venerable tradition in aesthetics that has it that when something is beautiful, the mark of its being beautiful is that we take a kind of disinterested interest in it, and that we simply wish to kind of sit back and bask in its glow and just contemplate it. So although we might say that a woman with certain bodily proportions is beautiful because she can bear children very well or is sexually attractive or whatever, that's much more visceral, much more utilitarian, whereas the real kind of ideal of beauty is supposed to be a more intellectual pleasure. It's kind of less carnal. So what's one of the things that's difficult for me is where precisely the line is to be drawn that leads you from that kind of a lower and more base carnal attraction to the higher point when we're talking, for example, about something like the beauty of the human form. Where do we jump from one to the other? It's clear that there's some line, but where is it? I don't know. I don't have a good answer there. And it might be contingent on various cultural factors and various other things. Who knows? Again, this is a place where I draw a blank. I really don't have much that's good or insightful to say. But it's something that I would like to explore and develop because it seems like something that you should have some ideas about and have some grounding about.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to
introduce. Can you help me with any of this, either of you?
That's what I was trying to introduce as well, that actual objects of beauty are always of some kind of mixed type. They appeal to the will, but they also appeal to this sense of form qua form. But Ken, what do you make of that?
Yeah, it's a spectrum, and I think I actually would disagree if you're asking the question of where is the line. You're asking a question that can't be answered. There is no line, and if we want to talk about the fundamental nature of reality, that's the way reality works. There is no, you can't measure the discrete position and the velocity and the direction all at the same time. It's fuzzy. It's probabilistic, and so that's how beauty works in a lot of ways. If you look at a woman and you say, well, is she beautiful? Well, is it purely a sexual thing? Is it purely an aesthetic thing? Do you have pure and innocent thoughts, or is there a bit of your... And actually, I want to bring this back to the Mandelbrot set. I think we are evolutionarily, primally predisposed to find that sort of thing beautiful just because there's such an inherent drive towards symmetry. I mean, if you want to find which plant is healthy, you want to look at the symmetrical plant, the symmetrical fruit, the symmetrical mating partner, the symmetrical boat or tool or whatever. It's such a strong genetic drive, and I haven't found the genes. I'd love to find the genes where you could say, oh, if you turn this gene off, they no longer have a preference for symmetry. But I think there is a good evidence that it is genetic, and so there is something primal and carnal about our appreciation, even of something as non-sexual as mathematics. So it's not that these systems are distinct, or that you can totally juxtapose one with the other, even though we talk like that, right? We have to use discrete words that have at times singular meanings, and we're trying to parse things out. So we want to think in black and white, and so it's useful to talk like that. But ultimately, when we do get down into the weeds of, okay, what about this specific piece of art? What about this specific object? Is this totally aesthetic beauty, or is this a carnal beauty? I look at it as a hierarchy. So at the top, you have the pure aesthetics, you have the pure godliness and whatever, totally divorced from animal instincts. But our animal instincts are ultimately derived from a desire from life, which, as you said, is sourced from God. So even the most base lusts and passions, as dirty and defiled as we might think them to be, because we're trying to lift ourselves up to a higher thing, that hellish kind of beauty is still rooted in a kind of divine beauty, that God is primary, and the satanic, perversions and lusts and whatever, those are ultimately derived from him in a way. Those are kind of the beginnings, the bare bones of how you start out, and then you're moving up and away from that. Is kind of a metaphor I would use.
Again, I agree that there is a sort of ephemerality or transcendence to the discrete ratios of the pure good versus the willful aspect of these things, which is why all of art and literary criticism and artistic criticism is a process of trying to come to this division and re-articulate it in finer and finer details. So on that note, then, when you note that symmetries appear in various forms, and we appreciate these symmetries just by virtue of the fact that we're truth-seeking creatures, we were rewarded in our evolutionary habitat for finding patterns. It ended up having survival value. And so what are we looking for in terms of symmetry? We're looking for symmetries that are centered around an axis of some kind of fundamental motif. So with a fruit, the way that plants grow, the way that organisms grow, they start from a seed, they start from a germ, and there's a process of differentiation that operates according to a certain algorithm. And so the better that the symmetries kind of rotate around that axis and highlight the underlying pattern, to my mind, the more beautiful they are. And I think that applies to music of J.S. Bach and applies to, I don't know, Rembrandt or whoever. But what do you think, Ivan?
Well, another thing is that in art, originality tends to be prized. And sometimes this can, of course, go to absurd lengths. I think we see that quite well now. But within certain limits, at least, it is acknowledged that although there are certain broad rules to artistic creation, various patterns that one might want to see instantiated in music, there are certain cases in which it is acceptable and even desirable to break those rules for the sake of some sort of higher art. And there are, I think, at least cases in which it's okay to transgress that, or it's valuable to do so, or even necessary to do so. Now, just before we went live, I'd mentioned Schoenberg to Eric briefly. And although I can't stand it, I can't stand listening to it, there are quite a few people who insist that he is brilliant, and that in terms of its sort of intellectual structure, that Schoenberg's music is spectacular. Now, perhaps I might be some sort of uncultivated Philistine, and after time, I may come to see the true value and beauty in all of this. Who knows? But I am willing, even without that, to acknowledge that there might be certain cases in which it's okay to, as I said, break the rules for the sake of some greater artistic goal. And if that's the case, then it's very difficult to simply reduce aesthetic composition, artistic creation, to merely an instance of following rules and seeking patterns. Because what about those cases on the fringes where you can color outside the lines, so to speak? Now you can say that these descriptions that you've given are just asymptotes, and that yes, indeed, exceptions can occur. But this, at least to me, is intellectually unsatisfying if we stop there. Where are the exceptions? How can we know about them? Do we have anything that can pinpoint us to when it is that a legitimate case of an exception can occur and when not? Something like that. So this would be sort of, I guess, a meta theory with regard to aesthetics. That would be something I'd like to have. I don't even know whether it's possible. It's something I think is worth exploring. So yeah, there's sort of that kind of thing on the fringes.
Right. Evolution seems to gravitate around types. Now, what I was attempting to go for earlier was highlighting the fact that beauty consists in living up to the ideal type of a particular species in question. And what you're talking about is the originary act, the evolutionary leap of bringing about the new species. And we are actually very sensitive to this, and we know when to accept it and when to reject it. So when someone does some kind of genre bending exercise and puts it out there, most of the time we're going to reject it as being, 1 foot in one pool and 1 foot in the other and not quite living up to anything. But once in a while you do have some kind of genius, and for all of his faults, I do think that Schopenhauer was a genius. I also, before we started, mentioned that Schopenhauer did have a tonal phase where he demonstrated a mastery of harmony that hadn't quite been...
Schoenberg, not Schopenhauer.
Did I say Schopenhauer? I say Schopenhauer so often that it rolls off the tongue. So Schoenberg had a tonal phase, and he demonstrated mastery of harmony that Wolff perhaps had reached a similar level, and the late Germanic Romantics. But when he moved into his atonal phase, this was a logical progression from the sequence of harmony that Wagner initiated. So one of the things when you study music history is you learn about Wagner's Tristan chord. That's from the prelude of Tristan and Isolde. The opening segment of that features what musicologists refer to as the Tristan chord, and theorists have been debating for the last 150 years about what tonic function that chord itself actually functioned in, what role it served. So that tonal ambiguity was carried forward with Schoenberg until he broke with tradition and set forward a new starting axiom. And this is that originary act, the evolutionary leap, where he says, now this is the new paradigm. Now, it's possible in my mind that a new paradigm doesn't have, even living up to the ideal type of a demonic species is still not the good. So I'm kind of introducing another ambiguity here because I've tried to attempt to explain Ivan's distinction of this originary creation being also a candidate for beauty, and we can explain that by, yes, if you're a genius and you've transcended the existing idioms, then you can set down this foundation stone, and then the next several decades often of your art are centered around perfecting that. But then there's also setting forth a new foundation stone that is only going to lead to ugliness. And that's Schoenberg, in my opinion. So I'm going to read the chat and tell me what you think of that.
All right. Well, I'm certainly not going to argue with you that Schoenberg paved the way for a lot of ugliness. Now, what you're saying about there being this kind of a leap into the creation or the emergence of a new species, if you want to take the evolutionary analogy further, we then would have this problem of whether you wish to see evolutionary progression or development in this kind of constant and continuous phase, or whether you want to look at it in the more sort of punctuated equilibrium sense of there being relative stasis followed by explosions of creativity, followed again by stasis for an extended period of time, and so on in these kind of discrete jumps. Um, so yeah, so I mean I acknowledge that that happens. What I would like to see, what I'm searching for, is a kind of explanation of when it is that we can expect these bursts of creativity. Because if we want to see it in this kind of more gradualistic sense, then we have that Sorites problem again, where it's like, okay, where do we draw the line? Where do we differentiate one thing from another? So I can grant that that happens, but then it complicates the theory so much eventually if you just say, all right, we have a certain amount of these new originary creations, these new emergence of species. With enough of this, your theory becomes so complicated that it loses the original coherence and simplicity that made it attractive to begin with. And I don't know if we might get into that eventually. You know, if we begin throwing so many additional tweaks to it that it becomes a mess. And the original plan of having it be this kind of simple thing of saying that which we regard as aesthetically successful conforms to certain patterns, conforms to certain types, except in this case, this case, this case, this case, this case. Well, that in itself is unsatisfying. That's another danger, and I'm afraid I don't have good answers for how to deal with this. So again, gentlemen, help me. You know.
All right, what do you think, Ken?
It kind of reminds me of reading poetry in different languages. These languages are different; they have different structures, and you can never perfectly translate a poem from one language to another. But you can try, and you can try your best to make it beautiful in both languages. And often it's said that it's most beautiful in the original language. Hopefully, if the poet was any good, it certainly is. But you can have different languages, and each language can have beautiful poetry. So, I mean, speciation. It's a question of where does speciation come from? Why do we have speciation? We have speciation because there are multiple environments. There's a separation in space and time between individuals. There's random mutations. So, I mean, we could think in a pure divinity sense, like if we just had the perfect environment or something. What is perfect symmetry? Well, perfect symmetry is a sphere. It's equidistant, all points to the center. It's a sphere. But spheres are we think of them as boring because reality has all of these little fractures and these disturbances and mutations. And so what you get from that is this differentiation. The tree, it starts out as a sphere, essentially a little seed, maybe not quite a sphere, but something close enough. And then it grows up through the roots and differentiates itself through the branches and leaves and so on. So why does this, how can we reconcile this sort of spherical ideal, and I'm using that as a metaphor, but sort of what you're talking about, like a perfect goodness and absolute universal goodness that is unchanged throughout environments. It's this one rule to rule them all. How do we reconcile that, which, we can conceive of that, and it seems that there's something to it. And then, of course, the reality of things that everything is always differentiating. Everything is there's always some new fashion or some new craze or something. And people really like this. People enjoy it. And again, I would say it's a drive for life. It's a drive to survive. It's a tension between life and death that produces this. If there was no tension between life and death, we would expect kind of totally uniform spherical beauty. But because there's this constant struggle, this constant battle that's ever present, that is really what produces all of the speciation that we see. no matter what field you're talking about, whether it's music or art or something. Now, the civilization which has really tried to maintain very consistent conceptions of beauty, I would say, is East Asian civilization, where they've had this aesthetic ideal of simplicity and harmony and going back to nature and meditating and nirvana, the undifferentiated. And so their artwork actually, over a very long period of time, remained extremely static. And there's other civilizations we could talk about as well. But it's that their aspiration was stasis and it was stability. They had a system that worked in the same way that crocodiles have a genetic code that works. So they've just stayed the same for millions of years. Whereas these more willful life forms or a more willful civilization, you're going to see much more what we would term creativity, this speciation, differentiation, and many, many different kinds of beauty within the concept of beauty as a whole.
So then you would just say that I am looking through this whole thing through a very European-centered perspective, and am thereby projecting that into something universal when it really isn't. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, maybe, but really, it's more like there. Yeah, there are these different ideas of beauty. I mean, for instance, think of the Jewish idea of beauty. The Orthodox, very traditional Jewish idea of beauty. They were extremely against graven images, sculptures, any depiction of any living thing. That's completely foreign to a Western conception of beauty. It's also reflected in Jewish music. The tonality of Jewish music is extremely different from anything that you would find in the Western canon. So, if we're having this whole conversation, it is within a very Eurocentric context. And if we actually look at kind of wider humanity, we can see that, there are these examples of, civilizations where they were very intent on reducing everything to calligraphy and a very rigid standard of art over extremely vast periods of time. So that is an ideal, and I would say that's more of the spherical ideal in a way. And the differentiated ideal, which produces all of these different genres, some of which are extremely successful. I mean, we can talk about the art of war, and I do consider war to be a kind of an art. Then the Western art of war has been vastly superior to anything else that's really ever been seen. And it's happened, this explosion, this evolutionary explosion has happened in a short period of time. Whereas, you see other tribes living in the Amazon where they have an art of war, but it's been the same art of war for the last, 10,000 or 40,000 or however many thousand years. They haven't changed the tools or the technology or the tactics. It's all the same. So, again, I would really put it back to, we live in a world of death pressure, of thanatos, where it's this pressure on us, and there is a certain aesthetic civilization or an aesthetic ideal which is always willfully striving against this pressure. I think of it like the hero fighting the dragon, and it's always seeking to infinitely expand itself, and this differentiation is a part of that. And ultimately, if you stand back and look at it as a whole, you can see how this fits in within more of a monistic idea of beauty. And if you boil it down to life versus death, that's the simplest principle that I could boil it down to.
We're getting a very Hegelian dialectic here. And I think that this reflects a comment that Spacetime DCR posted. The distance away from symmetry is where all the humanity is in Bach. Symmetry or squareness in form was actively avoided in classical composition. Right. There's some sort of ideal type for the particular composition, but if that was the extent of it, if that thanatos, if that perturbing principle wasn't present in the music, then it would be very unhuman because it wouldn't reflect our condition. And so to humans, it wouldn't be beautiful. Now, shifting away from beauty and onto morality, in any given moment, I mean, we talk about right action or proper action, but we can recognize that it always depends on your context. So, what's beautiful to an Orthodox Jew? What's beautiful to a traditional Chinese aristocrat? What's beautiful to a Renaissance Italian? They're going to be very different things. But at the same time, this doesn't produce a pure relativism because all of these functions take up roles within an ecosystem and they assign themselves to archetypes that have value positions against one another. So Ken mentioned the dragon that we're kind of in conflict with. Well, that force is actually out there in the world, and that's kind of what I was mentioning before, where there all are like negative ideal types. And we can live up fully to a negative ideal type and be evil, but at the same time be good at being evil, and we can recognize that. So the recent production, the movie Beauty and the Beast, the live action version with Emma Watson, the villain in that is Gaston. And if you watched that, I thought that the actor who portrayed Gaston in that did a really, really good job. But he was the villain. But nevertheless, I thought he did, of all the actors in that film, I thought he did the best. So that's just my take on how we are getting kind of into a murky territory where we want to identify what's the principle behind goodness. Well, the Hindus talk about if you are in the lowest caste, or I guess if you're in the agricultural caste, you have virtues particular to your type. And even if you lived up to them absolutely to the fullest and did everything that you were supposed to, you would still be inferior to the Brahmin that was neglecting his responsibilities because he partakes of a higher type than you do. Nevertheless, as that agriculturalist, you have no choice but to strive for the best of the type in which you're situated. So what do you think of that, Ivan?
Well, I mean, I would certainly agree that there's this kind of contextual element to everything. You could, for example, imagine a an incredibly beautiful cathedral placed in a city square, but it's then surrounded by other beautiful cathedrals, and so because it's in that context, its beauty is drowned out, and you don't see it anymore, and the whole thing just sort of the whole vista collapses from a kind of aesthetic. Or you can imagine something like that. The tension that I'm seeing is, on the one hand, what you mentioned about Bach's music apparently being universally respected because of certain structural properties that it has that are more or less universally appealing. We have that, and there certainly is something to that. But then on the other side, um, we have something that really I thought was embodied very well in a scene in the movie Dead Poets Society, where they had the students sitting together, and the teacher, played by Robin Williams, had them read the preface to a certain poetry textbook. And there was some really stuffy nonsense in there about how to plot on a graph the greatness of a poem. Uh, various sort of overstructured sort of things. And he had them, rip out the preface as if to say that it's garbage. So there is this definite truth about a certain kind of structure and order and symmetry and these other things that are appealing to us. And yet there's a way to sort of overdo it where the aim to introduce structure in order to produce beauty and a positive aesthetic response, if overdone, undermines itself, and then produces the opposite thing. So there's this tension, and maybe there's no final resolution to the tension. Maybe the presence of the tension is just simply an unalterable condition of finitude that we must accept. And if that's it, then that's it, I suppose. But yeah, we have, as I said earlier, this ideal represented by the convergence of every perfection within the divine nature, and then we have the world of mutability and finitude and composition that we live in, and somehow these must be reconciled together, or at least placed in a sufficient tension that they're both acceptable to us as human because they're tethered strongly enough to us as humans, but also that they're able to push us higher, into the divine, into that which is beyond us. And I suppose that's as far as I go with regard to what I can say about art. I mean, what better can we do? I guess.
Okay, unless Ken had a comment on that, I'd kind of like to shift into attempting definitions of these three terms and then maybe get a little more philosophical. But what did you have anything to say to that, Ken?
No, go on with it.
Okay, well then we can start with you. Do you have attempted definitions of truth, beauty, and goodness?
Well, I would start out with God, which I would define as eternity, perfection, and there's eternity, perfection, limitlessness. I'm forgetting one. Maybe it's expansiveness or omnipotence. Anyway, you could all boil it down to sort of a limitlessness. And then you derive from that definitions how does beauty aspire toward God? How does morality aspire toward God? And so for me, it comes down to, again, the tension between life and death, that you have death being the anti-God principle, life being the pro-God principle. And how do you achieve that within a given context? Well, if you look at very simple mathematical simulations, for instance, Conway's Game of Life, where you set like three simple rules of death, stasis, and rebirth, you can see these patterns emerge. And those patterns, which are able to sustain themselves for some time, actually end up being quite beautiful. And you can end up constructing an entire computational system, universal computation, forgetting what that's called at the moment. But you can construct a system that you can write programming languages for. So when we talk about, what is moral in this situation, well, if you're talking about, single-celled organisms, for them, going to the definition of what God is, then they want to survive and they want to reproduce, and so they are photosynthesizers, or maybe they're carnivores or something, but they're trying to do their best at that. When you get up to multicellular organisms, you're talking about very differentiated organisms, sexually differentiated. And then, as Eric talked about, you have different classes of people who have very different functions and roles in society. So it's not that there's some universal morality that we should all aspire to be investment bankers, or that we all have to be a soldier on the battlefield. We all have to be Spartans, or that we all have to be bookworms. There's no one type, no one moral type that I think is enforced in society. If you are, I think it kind of comes down to one's inclinations and one's birth-given talents, that if you are inclined to be a bookworm, be the best bookworm you can. Of course, there are like rules that we like to make universal. We like to say, like, don't steal from people, don't kill, 10 Commandments kind of stuff. But of course, there's exceptions to that. And I think we should have a lot more exceptions and define these things differently from how we do now. And I think there is, and maybe we could kind of steer it back in toward the nominalism thing. If we talk about a command like do not kill, well, does that mean total pacifism, or what was it really meant do not murder? And murder is a specific type of killing. And it's really a type of killing where you don't have the right to kill someone. But really, there are a lot of instances where we do actually have the right to kill people in self-defense, in times of war, if they've committed certain crimes, and so on. So obviously, if you have a very complex system of life, then you're going to have a very complex system of morality. Truth, we just had someone who was expert on truthful speech come on and talk about 6 axioms of truth. So if you ask me what's your definition of truth, I would try to refer you to him about that. But I think that the morality, I would tie it in that way.
All right. Now, if there's an opposite of Kurt's Asperger's syndrome, I think, can you have whatever that is? Because it's very hard to put you in boxes, whereas Kurt just, he loves boxing himself in. Not that that's bad. I liked it. It was good.
Well, he did say, or at least you understood him as saying at one point in the stream, that autism is enlightenment. So,
Something I've always suspected, but now I have confirmation.
Maybe the Buddha was autistic. Who knows?
I know that Aristotle definitely was. I believe that. At least Asperger's.
I mean, doesn't like when you see statues of like who is it, Socrates? Some of these ancient Greek philosophers, they do look like kind of like a neckbeard, autistic guy who like his mom's like, "Hey, do you want some chicken tenders?" And he's like, "I'm writing philosophy, mom." You know, I can imagine that.
So truth, beauty, goodness. Definitions, if you can.
well, it is tempting to refer these things, as Ken just did, to try and define God, but that automatically poses a problem for me because I don't think you can define God, at least not directly or without the mediation of analogical language. And when you use the mediation of analogical language in trying to do this, you then introduce all kinds of fuzziness and difficulty. And then that percolates down to your attempt to define goodness, truth, and beauty. Now, my best attempt at this, though, would be, well, let's talk about truth first. I favor a correspondence theory of truth because I think that any metaphysics whatsoever will have to presuppose something like it. Because when you declare something as true, you declare it in the form of a proposition, and a proposition always has some content. It's always about something. And merely by virtue of being about something, that proposition can either correspond to the state, can correspond by virtue of what it's about to something in the world or not. And so, merely by virtue of being a proposition, it's possible for that proposition to enter into a correspondence relation with the world. And if you're putting out some theory of metaphysics, you are again attempting to make truth claims and saying, this is the way the world is. So there seems to be something about a correspondence theory of truth, which it seems like is the kernel of any possible metaphysics. And so everything will sort of converge or lead to it in a way. Now, as far as goodness, well, again, we can always, as we've been saying, imagine counterexamples to good, general moral rules. We can imagine trolley scenarios, which are sort of difficult to distinguish what to do. It's difficult to say. Or let's say you have 10 people who will be killed if you press one button, and then one person who has the potential to do some great good in the future if he's allowed to live. What do you do? Or you can tweak the number. Let's say it's not 10 people. Let's say it's 1,000. Let's say it's 10,000. Whatever. The point is, at some point you'll reach a point where it will truly be difficult for you to say which button should be pressed, who should be saved, who should be allowed to die, regardless of what your views on ethics happen to be. So there are these kind of general problems. And I am inclined to think that goodness, truth, and beauty somehow converges in God. But because we live under conditions of finitude, because we cannot approach God directly except through analogy and apophasis, we're very limited in what we can say, at least in the sense of a kind of final and rigid definition. So yeah, we reach this kind of point where logic itself sort of transcends itself, or almost kind of breaks down into its opposites. And it again, we reach a point where it's difficult to know what to do, and there are these clouds that emerge, and they emerge simply because we are finite beings attempting to approach something which is inherently beyond our ken. We strive for that which we cannot reach, and yet we strive because we know it should be striven for, and that it's right to strive for it, which I suppose in itself says something.
Yeah, there are definitely transcendent aspects of these three terms that make it very difficult to produce a coherent definition, or at least a universally satisfying definition. But we're using them. And so they have to refer to something within human experience. And so that's kind of barring all of the meta narratives that we discussed before. Where I would turn is looking at what are we referring to when we talk about truth? Well, we oppose it to falsehood. And I agree with Ivan that it ultimately does have to boil down to something like a correspondence. If you call to mind typical examples of someone calling something true or false, I say, the sky is green. You might say, that's false, because this is not a valid reference to the state of the sky. Now, we have a reference in, or a referent in mind in order to call something true or false, which brings to mind this transcendent notion of truth, which is, if I talk about, I stand for the truth, I'm talking about the set of all truthful propositions. So all statements, all grammatically correct logical structures that have valid references. And on the point that Ivan brought up regarding this having to be the basis of any valid metaphysical scheme, I think that is the way that reality seems to be structured, that we don't have things in themselves. We always have, and so, for Schopenhauer, the will is the thing in itself, and the will, though, is not in satisfied with itself. It's always reaching out beyond itself, and so the actual substance of things always seems to be reaching beyond to some sort of external referent. And so this correspondence can be meant as a description of the ontological fact of reality, which I know that Ivan and probably Ken doesn't actually agree with this, but reality as illusion or reality as information as a reference to a transcendent signified. But the structure of things, the truth in the absolute sense, actually being this system of relations. Now, we can highlight in our actual conversation whether this corresponds to the universal principle, but that kind of raises the question of what to make of falsehood. If that's the actual structure of things, this network of logical systems being tied together by reference, by striving towards something outside of itself, then what is falsehood? There can't really be falsehood. And I do believe that is the case. So I'm going to bring in some sort of privatio boni. In order to define the true as opposed to the false, we have to say what the false is in that context, which is a proposition whose referent, whose true referent, is something other than the referent that you call to mind. And that falsehood essentially brings in a bifurcation of the statement. So maybe, going back to that statement of the sky is green, maybe I just had a bad definition of the term green and I really meant true. And the missing information when you interpreted my statement was that, he thinks that the sky is the color that I equate with green, but I'm missing this information that his true referent was something else. So both of us are drawing valid references. We're connecting true structures, and that's everything that we ever do is connecting true structures. But falsehood is kind of diverting attention away from we're not agreeing on the target of our reference. That would be what falsehood seems to be. Now, moving on to beauty, I would say that again, I have to go back to what the true is to define the beautiful. Beauty, as opposed to ugliness, any structure, and this, it's harder to define phenomenologically, so actually I'm going to go back and reset what I'm starting there. Using a phenomenological method, what we're actually referring to with beauty is a sensation, or not strictly a sensation, but a system of emotions, sentiments in a relationship between the object and the self. And that base emotion has willful aspects, and then it has intellectual aspects. And so if we're going to talk about an analogy between truth and falsehood and beauty and ugliness, we're going to say that beautiful things, truly beautiful things, are things that have references to an abiding structure, a true referent, something that is not a mistake of not agreeing on proper ends, the proper outreach of the act of appreciating beauty. So everything ugly in the world is produced by some agent. If you're going to buy that the will is the inner substance of things, then every like dung, like the most despicable insect and just the worst acts of incest and all of the terrible things, it seems to me that all ugliness is produced by an agent who desires it. And so it satisfies, in some limited aspect, the instinct that we have for beauty. And I think there are serial killers and there are mass murderers who do attempt to create the beautiful. And there are, modern artists who attempt to create the beautiful in the profane. But they're definitely always hitting on some small element of truth, which is why even the outcast, even the lowest member of society, has a chance of living up to an ideal. Ivan? I still have one
What
more
about
point,
the
but
desire for? Oh, I just want to interject here quickly. What about the desire for desecration? I mean, there seem to be people who just seem to take a pleasure in destroying something beautiful because it's beautiful and because they've destroyed it. So how can that be reconciled with a desire to aim for the beautiful, even if one happens to be doing it incorrectly with improper information?
mhm.
What then is the desire for desecration in your scheme? What is it?
Well, the fact that they desire it means that, as you pointed out, they take pleasure in it. And I would actually say that, and this is kind of a weird utilitarian turn, but it kind of all does boil down to some form of utilitarianism where the true is the pleasurable, is the satisfying, the beautiful is the satisfying, the good is the satisfying. God is ultimately satisfaction itself. So by destroying beautiful forms, this person probably has some narrative of the world in their head where they are enacting a form of justice. And that might be a very, warped version of justice because their conception of the system of valid references is missing information. So they're constructing a statement like, I have suffered. That's true. And they're going to point out to others should suffer. That's also true, but there's a connection that they're drawing, and I think others should suffer because others cause suffering. And if you're going to believe in some sort of universal reciprocity or justice, then yes, other people do deserve what comes to them. But the belief that you are the agent of karma, or you're the God's wrath on earth, or whatever it is, there's going to be some sort of misapplied referent. Again, as I said before, though, there has to be the actual positive content of it always has to be true. And because in a sense, if they do it, they are actually, in fact, acting out karmic justice. But it's very difficult for me to actually parse this all out on the fly here. But I think you get my basic point, that my proposition is that all acts of speech the positive content is based in truth. Falsehood is based on two people not agreeing on what the proper or intended referent is for a given statement. The beautiful, I take something to be beautiful because I get pleasure from it. It satisfies me, but I might be not taking into account, not thinking about, that's that privation aspect of the ugly, not taking into account the ugliness that I'm producing, the lack of beauty that I'm producing in the surrounding world, or even for myself in the future. Like, if I'm going to be in a prison cell for the rest of my life, like, yeah, maybe I experienced some beauty when I was chopping that guy's head off, but for the rest of my life, I don't get that. So you're just not factoring that in. And then goodness or morality, at this point, really just follows naturally. We're seeking the good, which is the most satisfying action, not only for ourselves, because if we take a holistic picture of the world and connect all the true statements in the proper fashion, the perennial tradition tells us that the other's fate is our fate, and therefore to seek the good is to seek the good for all, which doesn't entail equal outcomes for all. It entails encouraging all to pursue the path proper to themselves. So those are my definitions, and now if you can break them, then I'll be content to listen to that.
As far as why do people destroy things? Why do people desecrate? You could say that sometimes it's for justice, but I think often that's a rationalization. I think what it comes down to is people like, and you can see this with the youngest of children. There's actually many myths and fables and even psychological research. You can just look at a baby and how a baby likes to thrash and just sometimes destroy things. If a baby was given the strength of a man, babies would all be mass murderers. I mean, if you can think of the number of times a child gets angry and says, I'm going to kill this bug or I'm going to kill you or something, they do have murderous intent. They do have the desire to desecrate. So this is inherent to humans. It's inherent to a lot of different species. And I think it comes from the will to power that in destroying something which is ordered and beautiful, there is a kind of power inherent in beauty. And if you are able to desecrate it, that means that you are yourself more powerful than that thing, or at least that's what it symbolically represents. So, and I don't think desecration it necessarily has to be these terrible examples that Eric gave that kind of make me squirm a little bit. I think it can actually be something like, if someone commits a crime and you execute them, or even if you just place them in a prison. I mean, putting someone in a prison, putting a person in a cage is really a kind of a cruel act, and it is a desecration of a human life. But that desecration does serve a higher purpose. So, I mean, taking it back to the microorganisms, I talked about how there's photosynthesizers, and then there are these carnivores at the earliest stages of life. Eating another living thing is a form of desecration. It's a kind of a sadistic act, but it is part of this will to survive, and ultimately it is seeking to this competition between living things, extracting resources from one another. It is a competition to see who can best approximate or reach life within a given environment. So the desecration it's a sadistic mode, but it's in opposition to the masochistic mode. If you totally strip away sadism because it's an ugly thing, of course it's ugly, but all you're left with then is masochism, and that just becomes self-destructive. I think one of the reasons why people have turned so much towards masochism is because there's a very strong ideological narrative against sadism of that never has a place. But in reality, it does have a place within a complete moral framework. It does have a place even within beauty. I mean, MMA fights, there's something beautiful when he just smashes the other guy's face, and they're on a very primal, millions of years back in evolution. When he does that, he's really showing this potential for life and growth and overcoming death. So, I mean, there's a lot of instances where you can see it's beautiful, but of course, it's not universally. I mean, if I make something beautiful, I don't like to see others destroy it. But it's within the context of the life-death dynamic.
I guess what I'd say in response to what you said, Eric, is maybe definitely, I'm much more of a cynic than you are. I can definitely see it as possible and a thing that there would be people there who are just so malicious that they wish to destroy for the sake of destruction, and not because they believe themselves to be in pursuit of some kind of justice. I can see exactly what Ken said, that this is a rationalization, that this is something that you place atop what really are these kind of primal, dark stirrings within you that you just try to pepper up and embellish and make them look nice so that the real evil within does not have to be dealt with. I do think that there is that kind of unmotivated desire for destruction and desecration where you just say, I want to destroy because, period. And it's just
Mhm.
a simple, raw kind of exertion of power, which is interesting with regard to the whole context of nominalism, because as I described in that series of videos about nominalism, the original motivation in late medieval scholasticism for the introduction of nominalism was a concern about divine omnipotence and the idea that realism about universals would place certain constraints upon God's power, and that these constraints are uh, inadmissible because they're impious, essentially. To say that God can't do certain things. To say that God, for example, cannot uh, destroy a universal without thereby also destroying some particular object is a limitation on God's power. God is, of course, all powerful, and it's impious to say that he can't do these things. Therefore, we have to reject this whole realist schema. That was the motivation, but through a whole complicated series of historical and intellectual developments that it would take forever to go through here, and that I'm not going to do in a live stream. Those interested can check out the series I made. This eventually did morph into what eventually became this kind of Nietzschean obsession with a will to power. And I think I actually used this very term in one of the videos in the series where, especially through Descartes' thought, God is reduced to his power and he's morphed into this hidden, unknowable, dark, kind of twisted force that is transrational and that could instantly, if he wanted to do so, abolish all rationality, abolish all logic, such that there's no firm ground to anything other than God's arbitrary will, which is to say, ultimately, that there's no firm ground to anything. You can't take anything to the bank. And so God is turned in this weird sort of way into an almost kind of all powerful satanic figure that cannot be trusted, cannot be restrained. And there you also get this kind of Nietzschean will to power, the Freudian id. All of these concepts are related in this, long historical progression. But yeah, you get this odd thing where God, out of what was originally a pious impulse, is eventually over the course of centuries morphed into this kind of satanic figure, and then that idea of the will and of power is transferred into the human sphere, and it makes for everything from the all-powerful state and the totalitarian state that can do anything if there is sufficient political will, to the bland, boring, soulless last man kind of consumerism where, oh, and just do your own thing, that sort of thing. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that sort of pure desire for of expression of will that then leads to destruction and that destroys simply because it's a way for the will to flex itself. I think that's a real thing. I think that kind of
Yeah.
satanic impulse of destruction for the sake of destruction is real, and it's not something that's just made out of misdirected effort or wrong belief. It's an actual thing.
Right. Now, I don't believe that that discounts the fact that if you're seeking destruction for destruction's sake, the fact that you're seeking it, the fact that you desire it, implies a good in it, even if it's a relative one. What you're seeking is not the evil, you're always only seeking the good. And I think that's tautological because our desires, I guess this is sort of praxeological, but all human action is rational, seeking the satisfaction of our desires. So even if your intended result is the destruction of something else that's beautiful, the fact that that's your desired end state means that you are attaining what you think you're seeking. Now, my argument would be that what you're actually seeking, what everyone is actually seeking, is God. and we're all fundamentally mistaken, but mistaken in different degrees, right? And the worst kind of corruption of seeking God is seeking only omnipotence. And you don't even realize you're seeking omnipotence, but you can look at the historical progression that you just outlined into the postmodernists, with people obsessed with power structures and power dynamics. And the left today is completely at the mercy of their lust for power. And everything they do is predicated on obtaining power. So, yeah, I don't think that necessarily invalidates. I think that actually what you've said there strengthens the claim that all of us seek what we believe to be the good, but I mean, we are obtaining an element of the good because we experience some kind of subjective satisfaction of a preference, but we're kind of mistaken as to we don't keep in mind the actual end that we're in the long run really seeking.
Well, if you want to reduce it to a kind of praxeological tautology where everything that you seek merely by virtue of you seeking it is therefore good because you want it, what content does the concept of goodness then have? If everything that's done is done in pursuit of the good, and that which is done in pursuit of the good is that which is done, then what does it mean? What does it even mean to be good?
Well, because it's not just doing the thing in expectation of it and then achieving it. There's also the aftermath of it. And if the aftermath of achieving the good corresponds to a greater degree with the good that we sought, then that implies it's a more durable good and a better approximation of some kind of eternal good. So basically, the lower the time preference in pursuing goods, the better, the more moral.
Well, that itself is already a moral statement with content that those things should be taken into account, right? So, it's this whole thing. I understand this whole thing kind of feeds in on itself, where every proposition is justified by the ones that came before it and the ones that come after it, so that what you reason to after, it's a kind of cyclic, sort of self-referential, self-justifying sort of thing.
Which I think, if it corresponds to the structure of reality,
that.
that's my opinion as to the way things are actually structured. So truthful speech ultimately has to
Which is
reduce to it.
which is a very Chris Langan-esque kind of insight, by the way, that whole circular, self-referential, self-justifying aspect of things. But yeah, I mean, I can see the point where you say, even someone who says, I wish to destroy because I wish to destroy, and they'll make me happy to destroy. But can you push that further? Can you push it to someone who says, you know what, I don't care how I feel. Let me just do this because. How far can we push down the line of depravity? Because it seems at least conceptually possible. Certainly sick, and certainly there's something within us that revolts against that and says, "My God!" But we're philosophers here, so let's imagine it and let's run with this.
Well, for my system, Schopenhauer's system, it's easy to avoid that because the body with which we act is the objectification of the will that we substantially are, which means that every action of the body is, by definition, an act of will that is targeted, because all acts of will correspond to motives. And that's another of Schopenhauer's insights, which is basically just a restatement of the principle of cause and effect. All of our actions are caused by something, and if you take my leap and Schopenhauer's leap that what we are is the will, then all of our actions motivated by something end up being the equation of will towards some good or motive, and then the motive that we're attempting to satisfy. So, but that's just kind of a just so story. I mean, I don't know. What do you think, Ken? Can we come up with a scenario of total depravity, not seeking any good whatsoever, just pure chaotic act.
Yeah, I mean, people who seek chaos. I mean, it's interesting because maybe Buddhism, under a certain light, is total depravity. This wanting to get away from everything, get away from everyone, just meditate, go into the nirvana. There's a suicidalism to it. I mean, you could look at suicide as a kind of act of depravity where you're getting away from life. Um, but there's always some larger context where you could look at it and say, well, okay, this person committed suicide. What's the net effect of that? How did they affect other people?
But a truly depraved suicide would not be a suicide that says, "I wish to commit suicide to escape the pain of life."
Right.
It's a suicide that says, "I want to do this, just meh."
They couldn't even say,
Like,
I
no
want to
reason.
do this. They would just have to say, meh. There couldn't be a desire motivating it, or else it's
Oh
logical.
wow. Yeah, okay. So apathy. Apathy is what we're kind of boiling this down to, of just totally disengaging from the will, disengaging from rationality, just living a completely arbitrary life. And I mean, I think it was Derrida, however you pronounce that, who
I think
was
it's
really into
Derrida.
this idea.
Is that right?
Derrida, however you French people, who knows how you speak that language. But they're just trying to be completely arbitrary for the sake of it. And I go back to, what is this really all about? It's about the inversion of aesthetics. I mean, these are people who are philosophers at the end of the day, who look at the Western tradition, they look at aesthetics, they say, oh, wow, everything really makes sense. It's all about life and death and striving and the will. But how could I just invert it for the fun of it? How could I just do that because I'm bored? And it's almost a peacocking. It's almost a look at how cool I am because I can stand over the entire moral system and I can just completely disregard it and say, Matt. And that's what Nietzsche refers to as like this aristocratic apathy, where I think he says the hero in the Christ story is not Christ, it's not the Jews, it's this Roman aristocrat who says, if you want to kill him, go ahead and kill him. It's up to you. And he just stands over at everything, completely disengaged from the emotionalism and passion of the Christ and the passion of the masses. So yeah, I guess that is a concept, and maybe if we could draw it back to the trolley example, do you kill the genius or do you kill some number of people? Really, when you ask people these kinds of questions, you get sort of two groups of people, which of course it's a spectrum, but we could boil it down to two groups. One, they're the axiomatic, never kill anybody. I'm just going to step away from this question, not answer it. And I think that kind of algorithmic morality, where you say it's never okay to kill, and I'm not even going to think about it because that's evil. That works in certain contexts, especially within a collective context for people who aren't good decision makers. But then people who are very computationally minded, they're going to say, okay, well, let's actually do the computation and try to figure out what is the best solution. So in a sense, it is more of a feminine maternal mindset, the algorithm never kill, versus the more masculine decisive mindset of, let's try to solve the problem no matter how difficult it is, because that's just our job and it's what we have to do. It's the very in the world, very attached to what's going on, versus the detached, enlightened autiste. So there is this, and that's exactly what early serial killers, Leopold and Loeb, they were trying to do. They read Nietzsche. They were like, how do we become the Ubermensch? We have to transcend morality. They didn't, and it was exactly their justification. They said, we didn't want to kill the guy, but we had to do it in order to truly transcend morality. So you do have these people coming out here. And ultimately, what I would say is, they say that they want to transcend the will and morality, but that itself is a will. That itself is the desire for transcendence. So it all goes back to the will. Being against the will is itself a kind of a will. That's how I would put it.
I suppose what you can say is that once you've removed God from the picture and the transcendence he represents, who is there worshipped but yourself? And if that's the case, then you should be something which in this perverse and distorted view of things is worthy of worship, namely something, transcending the bounds of morality. Let me break these strictures because that's how I'll demonstrate my awesomeness or something. But yeah, like just diversion and turning away from everything, which is just a suicide because bad. The absurdity of it, I can't even keep from laughing at it.
It's kind of like Two-Face from
Don't
Batman.
do yourself, Ivan.
That's
Don't do it.
Two-Face from Batman is what that represents. Just flip a coin.
Or the Joker. The Joker does that all the time.
Or that guy in No Country for Old Men, Chigurh. Yeah, call it. Flips a coin. Mm-hmm. Right. That too. That's a great film about nihilism. Actually, come to think of it. And even the scene at the end where the car crashes into him and he gets injured, there's no reason for it whatsoever. It's not like he's suffering some sort of retribution or justice for his crimes. It's just, it happened, Mm-hmm. And now that brings us to the question, if you don't mind me going there just briefly, of the implications of nominalism for truth, goodness, and beauty. And nominalism in its most fundamental sense, by denying all universals, denies the ability to group or structure any two things together, and so everything is radically individuated. That means that there's no such thing as a murder anymore, really, because a murder is a series of actions and a series of events grouped together under a certain aspect, grouped together under a certain moral framework, and then by that grouping and by that framework given a meaning. Well, if you're a real thoroughgoing nominalist, you take that seriously. There's no such thing as murder. It's just a thing that happened, or a series of things that are disconnected, and there it was. There's also no such thing as a work of art.
There can't be any such thing as the good or the beautiful, or for that matter, there can't be any such thing as nominalism. It's ultimately self-destructive.
And you could say to a nominalist that that's self-refuting, but a real nominalist wouldn't care. They're like, I don't care about consistency. I'm a nominalist, remember? It's the ultimate philosophical expression of meh.
Yeah, a lot of these people, I meet types like the anti-natalist crowd, who I don't know how they can even be vocal or spend effort in making arguments about antinatalism, because it's like, you're an antinatalist. But and they might say, oh, we're not nominalists because we want people to be happy, and antinatalism achieves that. But you talk to these people, and I think fundamentally it's like this lack of will for life because they're focused on something else. And I have to think that these people would be the kind of original 12th century monks who would be in the monastery writing these tracts about nominalism or writing doctrine, writing letters. They have these just their physical structure, the way that they look, and their attitude about life. They really don't want to have kids. They don't really want to pass themselves on, but they do have this idea of how do we transcend this moral structure? How do we think beyond that? And there is an element to creativity there, where if people can think outside the box and say why do we care about this or that? Then that is it is a element of desecration, where if something has been built up and everyone worships it because that's tradition, and then someone comes along and says, I think the emperor has no clothes, and then everyone is shocked in horror. But that can serve an evolutionary function. While the person themselves, they think they're just being completely nihilistic, but in fact, their nihilism might serve some larger purpose in breaking down false structures and allowing stronger structures to grow in their place.
Mm-hmm. So
exactly.
No, go ahead first.
I was going to say, although I'm not a nominalist, I can understand the value of that sort of critical, corrosive and destructive philosophy because it's in its proper place. It should be used to keep those who create, both in terms of works of art or societies or systems of thought or what have you, it should be used to keep those people honest. The problem is when it becomes sort of an end unto itself. And we've sort of reached that in modernity now, where it's, we live in the culture of meh. You go to an antinatalist, and if he says that he wishes for people to be happy and wishes for them to avoid suffering, ask him why he wishes this. Now, he can't really give an answer that in any way goes beyond, well, I just happen to want that personally. Well, why do you happen to want that personally? And you can keep asking questions like this, but eventually you'll hit rock bottom, and that rock bottom is meh.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to, for those who don't want to watch the stream all the way to the end, here's a 5-second encapsulation of everything here. Your ultimate choice in the end: God or meh.
Yeah, and I think that meh is impossible, as I was trying to point out before with the praxeology thing. All of those literary constructions that we mentioned as exemplifying this non-ideal are themselves aesthetic creation with a purpose. And in Mendham, who wants to end all life, is very motivated by his purpose in life. So I don't really think that, if you're going to be honest as to what nominalism is, it's not what it, in a straightforward sense, seems to be. There is an element of criticism that I think is useful, as you point out, and there's an element in the meh philosophy that's useful, and that is detachment. But when you make it the end in itself, just like with equality, people believe in a certain level of equality because reciprocity is good, right? We believe in fair treatment and people earning proportional to their deeds because that's just the way nature works. I mean, so we're inclined to affirm that. But then when you abstract the ideal of pure equality, which is what this meh boils down to, it's like whatever happens, it's all the same. No hierarchy of value, no preference. So we make this equality the absolute ideal, but it's not a possible ideal, not in the way that we think it is. There's an element of truth in equality, right? There's a reason why so many people become leftists. There's a reason why so many people get fired up by this. And the critical aspect where they are tearing down traditional structures, and the fact that they're able to see what's false in the traditional structure is an affirmation of the truth. And that's what keeps them invigorated, but it's a parasitic mentality. Because as you break down the traditional structures, very soon you'll reach the point where you're no longer encountering truth because there's no more truth for you to break down. Now, on the flip side of that, though, I think the other reason why this is such an invigorating mentality is that, well, as Meister Eckhart put it, the good man does what he does simply because he's good, not because he desires it. So this is seemingly that meh philosophy, but it's kind of in its proper vein. And that would also be the mentality of the so-called avatar or incarnation of God, who to God all things are good. To God everything really is equal in some sense. Like, yes, he approves of good and disapproves of bad, but contextually. But bear in mind, to God, and this is violating certain prescriptions against direct cataphatic statements about God, but anyway, from God's perspective, there is no context because there's no perspective. It's just everything at the same time. And so God sees the ultimate truth, beauty, and goodness in all things, which, in my opinion, ultimately boils down to his own nature in the end. But that, you do see this parallel where the avatar, the incarnation of God, the exemplar of truth, beauty, goodness, would be absolutely preferenceless. Like, they would simply act without will, in perfect accord with all of these ideals in the abstract, which is also unattainable. At least we can't, achieve it through moral effort, through our own persons as humans. So there's definitely this kind of Christ, Antichrist aspect to the chaotic, indifferent hero, anti-hero figure.
All right, well, I'm going to make a response to that, and then I'm going to get up and turn the lights on because the sun has set and it's very dark here now. All right, so now what you just said, Eric, about the meh philosophy being impossible to implement in practice because even by pursuing criticism and destroying, you are aiming at an ideal, and so thereby contradicting the meh philosophy. But a true, serious adherent of the meh philosophy wouldn't care about contradicting himself. You know, if you point out to him, you've contradicted yourself, what would he say? He would say, meh. You know, so ultimately, this is something that you can't argue a person out of. It is, who am I? Right, I believe it was Aristotle that said that unless a man has been raised a certain way, he shouldn't be allowed to learn ethics because if he hasn't been given the proper upbringing, he'll just criticize and destroy every single ethical theory that there is.
Right.
And that points out this kind of thing where there's just this basic pre-rational need to accept the idea of ideals, of something to strive for. You can't convince someone who fundamentally doesn't care about truth to be truthful. Because I was like, well, why should I? It was like, well, because you should. Because it's the truth, period, the end. You know? And if they're not willing to go along with you on that, there's nothing to say to them. All you can do is pray for them and say, you know, may God have mercy on you. I don't know what to do for you. But that gets to what I'm saying, that the fundamental choice is God or meh. And if it's really meh, then you don't care if you contradict yourself in the course of living according to meh, because that doesn't matter.
Right.
That's how deeply, horrifically, terrifyingly nihilistic it all is. Now I'm going to go turn on the light.
And that's a good idea. Now the thing is, the truth of the world does not reflect this. So the person builds up this non-ethos or builds up nihilism philosophically after tearing everything else down, and maybe they can't be reasoned with. But reality will, in some sense, correct their behaviors because they're acting on a false model. And I mean, just from an evolutionary perspective, our cognition is intended to model accurately our environment, assess threats, and find resources. And this lack of a hierarchy of values is not reflective of the true state of nature, and therefore it will be proven false by experience. And this would be also Meister Eckhart, God in all things, always leading us back to him. Now, maybe that entails some sort of journey through the underworld or journey through hell to purify us of our misconceptions. But I think ultimately it's not a permanent state, this kind of illusory detachment.
I would agree with that. One of the things that I've been giving a lot of thought to, and one of the reasons why I've left off my nominalism series unfinished, is that there's a certain thing that I intend for that series to culminate to. Namely, I want to bring us to the place where we are today in modernity, and having all of its problems placed before us, offer some suggestions as to what we can do about it. And the best thing that I can think of is that we're now in the thrall of this critical, destructive, nominalistic ethos. And the only way for any kind of meaningful culture to be reborn in the wake of all that is to turn the weapons of nominalism upon itself and to have criticism criticize the critics and destroy them so that the way can be paved for something new to reemerge. And I don't know how else we can do things. And it's an interesting and maybe even beautiful kind of paradox, I would say.
Well, that is what you see with the whole meme culture and all of that. I think that's a prophecy that has already kind of come true. What do you think? You're more the meme expert than I am, Ken. So, in that connection.
Okay, as the resident meme expert, I actually watched I don't think I watched the whole thing because of my short attention span. But the postmodernism and the alt right video that Ivan made, where he talked about the danger of meme culture and in fighting postmodernism, you think you're winning, but really you're just becoming entrapped within postmodernism itself. I don't remember if I found that video as a response in the comments to a video I had already made, or if I made the video in inspiration to that video, but I thought of them as kind of complementary. Where my video is called Postmodern Alt Right, and that is the idea. That is the idea that you have to have a postmodern right. And this is something that the right wing has been very resistant to embracing. I mean, you can think of fascism really as the right was embracing modernism, and it was very successful. You know, the left had modernism, so then the right was like, okay, we'll do modernism too. And it was successful in a limited extent. Now, there's postmodernism. The left has adopted it. The right really hasn't, outside of this kind of meme culture. So I definitely think that is the way to go. And as far as when we're talking about nominalism, I think it is, we have to look at it in degrees. Like, is there such a thing as a perfect nominalist? Well, no, because they're always within a context of a greater truth about things. But we do think of like a badass hero or a badass fighter is the guy who is like detached from the situation. Like he's the Jason Bourne who's just shooting bad guys and he doesn't care. And at the same time, you look at Thanos from Avengers Infinity War, and it's like he has no personal stake in his quest to kill 50% of the universe's population. He's doing it out of this sense of like duty to a higher ideal, but the whole thing is about how he overcomes his individual passions and desires to do this thing. So there is something valuable in being able to suppress the will and the passions and kind of distill yourself and become single-minded in your purpose and put aside all of your animalistic desires and just kind of focus on one thing, but not to do it completely. I mean, even if you try to do it completely, there's always some element of will that is present there.
You need to do that, but ironically,
yeah, I mean,
right, Ken? Do that, but ironically.
Yeah, this whole conversation is ironic. Like, don't take anything that's said here to be serious. We're just joking around. This is all very high, convoluted, like esoteric humor. It's really an inside joke.
Especially that part right there.
Yeah, right.
That's pretty meta.
It's all
And that part right there.
And because of that, you can't criticize any arguments that we've said or anything that you have a problem with. You just don't understand. We're laughing at you because we think this is funny. Like, you think these are hard philosophical questions, but this is actually a comedy act, and you're too dumb to realize it. So that's what it is, basically.
It's the argument from Jon Stewart.
Yeah.
I don't endorse irony broism, and I think like the dichotomy that I kind of highlighted before, where there's the true indifference or true detachment, and that is a spiritual ideal, and then there's the false one, which is really just a tearing down of true hierarchical distinctions that are present to you. Like, my inclination is always in earnest, so I do disagree with Ken about irony being necessary. I also kind of disagree about like deconstruct the deconstructionists. It's probably a valuable path, but I think that like actual honesty and genuine intent to pursue truth, beauty, and goodness is so rare that just like when you encounter it, it can be a breath of fresh air. It can be something that stands apart, and maybe I'm just going to kind of segue into the Jews believe, some Kabbalistic Jews believe that their Messiah, people come, like 25 people every generation or something come about who could be the Messiah, who could live up to this ideal. And I think that's basically the way it is, that some of us, if we really tried our best to be truthful, pursue the truth, pursue a beautiful lifestyle, pursue a moral lifestyle in earnest, not ironically, just full good faith, being a good boy.
Not
Like,
ironically at all.
no, no, not actually ironic. I don't think that that's the way forward. I think that if, good faith community and good faith discourse, all we need is one genuine, moral, modern person, and I think that all of the rest would just shatter. All of the falsehood, all of the postmodernism, they would shrink from this one good. I don't think there's a single good man alive today. Not in the sense that, the possibility of virtue for the human being. I don't think anybody's there. But if anybody got there, we would all basically bow down to them. That's my opinion. But
do you see what you just did when you said that there's a kind of intrinsic magnetism to this more objectively oriented, realistic philosophy that focuses on the transcendentals of, truth, goodness, and beauty, that has this innate attraction to it? You're, by saying that, already launching into a criticism of the postmodernist kind of meh philosophy. So you are criticizing the critics. It's not that I'm not advocating the criticism of critics as a strategy. I'm saying it's literally the only move. There's nothing else.
I don't know how to reply to that without criticizing it. So you may be right. I mean,
but he's not the critics. Okay, so what we have here is we have Eric is prophesying the return of Christ, who's going to be a perfect moral individual and save us all. And there's no other solution besides that. And then we have Ivan saying you have to criticize the critics, and that's the only option. And I'm kind of more on the Ivan side just because I know I'm never going to be Christ. And so therefore, like, if I cannot manifest that in myself, the only thing I could try to do is like try to tip the scales in a more Christly direction. And that would be through this strategy of criticizing the critics. And I guess you could put it in different ways of how exactly do you go about doing that.
For all of my belly aching in that postmodernism video, I'm not against the idea of a postmodern right, provided that it's not a terminus, provided that it doesn't stop there. Criticize the critics, and then when they're gone, build something. Don't stay in this ironic mode, because if you do that, they win. They win even losing to you.
Yeah. And again, my inclination is just start building something now. Start building moral capital in yourself. Start building a philosophical model, and build it in a positivistic sense where you're founding it on firm, basic intuitions that we all share, things like that. I think that basically the dissent right, is for the most part philosophically illiterate, which is a shame. A lot of the postmodern left is actually very philosophically literate, and there's a big mismatch there now. But a lot of what they read is not, I don't think, like the correct path to set down on. And no, you said, Ivan, that you caught a little bit of the interview with Kurt. What do you think of that basic? Because I think what Kurt is doing is really not ironic, in very serious earnest, trying to remake the world. And I think that you follow him on Facebook, but what's your take on that kind of approach?
I've only watched the first half of the stream, and I'm not familiar with enough of the details of Kurt's view to really be comfortable saying very much here. But I know that what he wants to do is to create a kind of value-free, scientific political language. And unless I'm very much mistaken, that seems immediately to be a case of him shooting himself in the foot. I mean, how do you have something value-free when you're talking about politics, which is inherently value-laden? It wouldn't be politics if it wasn't that. So is he just reducing it to saying something like, well, if you observe human societies, they tend to disapprove of thieves, of liars, and so forth. And so given these kind of more or less universal universally observed facts, we can take these as empirical data and then use that as something to strive to merely because we happen to observe it in such a way. This is actually Enlightenment anthropology. You know, it's more or less the kind of thing that you see from those in the era of, you know, a Rousseau or a Montesquieu or that sort of thing. So it seems to me like he's trying to revive Enlightenment era anthropology. But again, I don't know about his work in enough detail to say more than that.
Right.
If that is what he's trying to do, I would recommend that he read Carl Becker's book, The Heavenly City of the 18th Century Philosophers. Just, you know, but anyway.
He definitely would really hate to be compared to the Enlightenment philosophers. I think he's pretty much like the Enlightenment was a bad idea. And the way that I would describe what he's doing is I think he sees it as his mission and his job, because I think he really enjoys it. And he just has this fanatical idea about, I'm going to create this system, which if someone seized power, it would be really good idea to like teach this at a university level, and to have this kind of be a foundation for a new ideological framework of a theoretical new society or new state. Or like if we had done this in the past, it would have prevented the problems that have developed. So then when I ask Kurt, I say, well, how do we get from point A to point B? He says, oh, that's a completely different problem. So he's not prescribing, I don't think, this political neutral, value neutral political language as a solution to the problem. He's just saying that like, if you have a society, if you have control of a society, you should implement this thing because it is the best from an evolutionary scientific standpoint. That's how it's designed. But as far as how do you tear down the society that we have, that's not what he really specializes in. And I've heard him say
he used to specialize in
kind
that.
of anecdotal stuff.
He used to specialize in
that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know enough about that background to comment.
But yeah, I didn't really want to get into a conversation about Kurt in particular. It's just his approach, I think, is more where my mind has always been, and I don't know if that's just these are two complementary aspects. I mean, when it comes to we need to be postmodernists on the right and critique the postmodernism from this kind of deconstructionist lens, do you think that there's room for both approaches? Can we be both positivist and earnestly pursuing truth and also being ironic and this sort of thing? And if that's possible, can this coexist in a single figure? And if so, who best exemplifies that?
Well, we have to do that. I think the point I was making is that ultimately there's no other move for us. You know, you either do this or your king is captured. You know, that's it. So we criticize the critics, we lambast them, we laugh at them. We, you know, you have those like what's occurring to me right now are the memes about you know, Muslims, these lurid images of people maimed from bombs, and then it just says, "But how good is the food, though?" You know, that sort of thing. You know, like really kind of visceral criticisms of diversity or whatever else it is. You have to sort of, I guess, one of the ways to really undermine a power structure is to make it an object of ridicule, and it's something that you have to resort to when you don't actually have the force of arms necessary to meet that power structure in open battle. You know, so you do what you have to. And if it's self-ironic that we have to use irony to defeat the ironists, well, c'est la vie. You know, it's just that we have to take care to remember that once we've done that and the ground is clear, we have to start building.
Eric, have you watched any Murdoch videos?
Yeah, everyone's watched Murdoch. I mean, yeah, okay, it's funny.
Well, okay, so if you want to talk about the idea of like constructivism, constructing the beautiful, trying to work toward that, but at the same time having the irony where everything is like making fun of itself and like, oh, it's just a big joke. I think those videos exemplify that, where I mean, they are using like kind of B-rated animation where it's not really such a serious thing. But on the other hand, like within that, there is like a clear, like there's this innocence of purpose. There's this genuineness about it. Like we really believe this stuff, and this is actually what like animates our life. So it's not just all like very cynical irony bro memes. Like I think you can have the irony and pair that with here is the ideal that you should be striving for and not just remain in the destructive mode.
And that brings me to something that I want to make a video about at some point, provided I can overcome my inertia and laziness, which is an enormous proviso. But anyway, uh, and it's about meta modernism, which is this term that's only really entered into the discourse a few years ago by certain people who've been looking at trends in culture and trying to determine what the next thing is after postmodernism. And the general conclusion, more or less, of the analysis that's been reached as about what metamodernism is that its primary characteristic is this kind of vacillation between two opposites, a sort of pendulum-like swinging back and forth, where on the one hand, we're irony bros and we want to destroy because we see all this rot and we have to destroy the rot. But then we're also sincere because we crave and we strive for meaning. And yet, though we crave and strive for meaning, we're immersed and we've been marinated in this postmodern culture that's taught us to spurn all of those things. So we see the difficulties with them. We can't full-throatedly embrace them because of where we are as a culture, and yet we want them. We cry out for them, and so we swing back and forth between these two opposites, and we live in this kind of tension. Which, to circle things back to our discussion of beauty, for instance, we have this again this tension of this notion of symmetry and these objective standards for what makes something beautiful and artistically and aesthetically successful. But then we have these notions of creativity and originality smashing these boundaries. So again, a swinging back and forth. And when I heard that, it kind of, I was jarred by it because I realized that without even knowing what this was, what this term metamodernism was, I had found myself in the thrall of it. Even in simple things like what to make YouTube videos about, because I want to finish my nominalism series and I want it to have some kind of satisfying final conclusion as to how to go forward. But there's so much complexity and so much to talk about and so much nuance that I worry that the project might be beyond my ability. So here I am vacillating and a meta-modernist despite myself, and perhaps we all are.
Yeah, I do think so. And as far as being honest with the circumstance, I mean, there's a sense in which, going and getting on a white horse and charging into the ranks of Antifa would be kind of anachronistic, and even if you meant it in complete earnest, it just wouldn't be honest somehow, even if you were intending it to be so.
Right.
So there's this, like, we're in a situation that is between paradigms, and our attitude has to reflect that in some sense. Now I'm seeing Todd Tim message in the comments saying that he'd like me to tie this in with metaphysics, and so I'll just make a little one and say that the basis of everything, when you boil it down, is some form of paradox or some form of antinomy or some form of opposition that seems conceptually irreconcilable, but somehow in the true nature of what is reconciled. And so here we are, and we find this like need to be ironic and this need to be genuine, and they have to reconcile, but they're not going to reconcile outside of the working through and grinding through the process of making these value judgments and creating these aesthetics. And now, stepping away from metaphysics, I would just say, like, I am unabashedly a knicker. I'm a big believer in Nick Fuentes, and I think that if you want to look to someone who's doing this very well, it is Nick, because he puts in the time to learn the relevant facts, but then and also has mastered how to put on the ironic face, and it's definitely something that he's putting out consistent good content, and I think more of us can learn. We could take a page out of Nick's book in as far as how to reconcile those two aspects.
Eric, you're about to get this stream banned with words like that.
Nicker,
I can't
Nick.
get over that.
It's what the Nick
No,
Fuentes fan.
Stop. We've done enough damage already. We're done. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I agree. There's something unique going on there where it's like he almost has like this court jester personality of always aggressive, always on the offensive, always deconstructing the, but like anytime he's in a debate and his opponent says something, he's like, you think that? And he just starts laughing. Like he doesn't even offer an argument, but then he follows it up with, "Oh, I know all these intricate details that really no one should know, let alone someone in their early 20s or late teens or whatever he is." So it is an interesting juxtaposition. It does work well, and because it's so unique, you don't see it in a lot of people. But obviously, if you could produce more of that kind of a person, I think that person like has to be produced. Like it's just going to happen. So he is the face of a new generation, maybe.
No, exactly. It's as I said, we are meta modernists despite ourselves, and that is who Nick Fuentes is. He is the meta modernist man.
Well, I'm really looking forward to that video when you do put it out. I hope it's soon. We should probably, because we're almost at 2 hours here, so if we have any final statements, I'll go ahead and let you go first, Ivan.
I greatly enjoyed this, and it's helped me to clarify a lot of my thinking on some things, and especially the ending and realizing how it all ties into metamodernism has just fed my suspicion that we're all being sort of ineluctably led into that direction despite ourselves by some kind of force greater than us. I started this discussion with a doubt, a desire for the more realist-oriented approaches to beauty, which was just one particular area where I didn't have particularly strong views. And yet I carry this baggage of doubt. And I'm still that way, but I feel ready to accept that middle position and just accept myself as someone who's meant to swing back and forth, because that's simply where we are in history. So thank you for this.
Yeah, thank you, Ivan. Ken?
That's all from me for tonight.
Okay, and I'll let commenter Dan Croyer have the last word, which is, what about charging into a crowd of Antifa ensconced in a military-grade robot exoskeleton? So I think we've all learned some things here, and yeah, we'll see you on Saturday.